The Wilsons had always been a picture-perfect family. At least that's what people in Oak Ridge thought. Thomas Wilson, a respected lawyer with salt and pepper hair and a firm handshake, had built a successful practice from scratch. His wife, Eleanor, was known for her charity work and impeccable garden. Their 3 children, Michael, Sarah, and David, had grown up in a beautiful colonial house on Maple Street, attending the best schools and seemingly destined for greatness. But beneath the surface, tensions simmered. Michael, the eldest at 35, had followed in his father's footsteps, joining the family law firm straight out of Harvard. Sarah, 33, had become a surgeon at Boston General, always the overachiever. And then there was David, 29, the family's black sheep who dropped out of college to find himself and now worked at a local bookstore, writing poetry no one published. On a crisp autumn morning, Thomas Wilson passed away unexpectedly from a heart attack. The family gathered at the old house, shell-shocked. Eleanor moved through the rooms like a ghost, accepting casseroles from neighbors with mechanical smiles. Michael immediately took charge of the funeral arrangements, while Sarah handled the medical paperwork with clinical efficiency. David arrived late, his shirt wrinkled and his eyes red-rimmed. "You couldn't even bother to be on time?" Michael hissed when David finally walked through the door. "I had to drive from Portland," David said quietly. "Traffic was bad. Portland's 3 hours away. Dad's been dead for 10. Sarah stepped between them. "Not now? Mom needs us to be civil." The funeral was a somber affair, attended by half the town. Thomas Wilson had been well respected, though few had known him well. Colleagues spoke of his dedication to justice, his sharp mind, his unwavering principles. Eleanor sat rigid in the front pew, flanked by her children. Michael and Sarah ramrod straight, David fidgeting with his tie. It was a week later when Richard Simmons, Thomas's longtime friend and the family's attorney, called them to his office for the reading of the will. They gathered in the wood-paneled conference room, the air thick with anticipation. "I'll get straight to it," Richard said, adjusting his glasses. Thomas was very specific about his wishes. Eleanor would receive the house and half of Thomas's savings. The family law firm would go to Michael, as everyone expected. Sarah would receive a generous cash inheritance. But it was the final bequest that dropped like a bomb in the quiet room. "And to my youngest son, David, I leave my privately held company, Wilson Property Holdings, including all assets and holdings." The silence was deafening. Michael's face flushed crimson. Sarah's mouth opened in shock. David looked up, confusion written across his features. "That's impossible," Michael finally spluttered. "Dad never even mentioned owning a separate company." Richard nodded sympathetically. Thomas was a private man. Wilson Property Holdings operates several commercial buildings downtown and an office park near the highway. The company's net worth is approximately $27 million. $27 million? Sarah repeated, her voice hollow. David ran a hand through his messy hair. "Why would he leave it to me?" Richard produced an envelope. "He left this for you, David. For your eyes only." The ride home was silent. Eleanor sat in the back of Michael's Audi, staring out the window. Sarah had taken her own car, claiming she needed to get back to the hospital. David had disappeared immediately after the reading. Michael gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. "It makes no sense," he said through clenched teeth. "David has no business experience. He's going to run it into the ground." "Your father had his reasons," Eleanor said quietly. Michael shot her a look in the rearview mirror. "You knew about this?" "Not the details. But Thomas always worried about David. You and Sarah have your careers. He wanted to make sure David would be okay. By handing him millions he doesn't deserve? What about the firm? I've put in 15 years there, working 80-hour weeks, building our client base. Dad left me the family business, but Wilson Properties is worth 10 times as much." Eleanor sighed. "Michael, please. Your father just died. And apparently, he didn't trust me with everything he built." When they arrived home, David's beat-up Honda was already in the driveway. They found him sitting in Thomas's study, a letter in his hands and tears streaming down his face. "What did it say?" Michael demanded. David looked up, his eyes red. He knew. Knew what? Everything. Why I left school. Why I couldn't work at the firm. He knew. Michael scoffed. "So enlighten us. What great secret justified cutting out the son who actually cared about his legacy?" David stood up slowly. "You think I didn't care about Dad? You have no idea what went on between us." "Boys, please." Eleanor said, but neither was listening. I worked my ass off for him, Michael shouted. While you were finding yourself or whatever the hell you've been doing for the last decade, I was here, keeping his business running, taking care of Mom, being responsible. You were being the perfect son, David shot back, making sure everyone knew how much better you were than your screw-up little brother. Did you ever once ask why I left? Did any of you? Sarah appeared in the doorway, drawn by the shouting. Ask what? David looked around at his family, his mother's tired face, Michael's anger, Sarah's confusion. He carefully folded the letter and put it in his pocket. It doesn't matter now. Dad made his choice. If you think I'm just going to let this go, Michael started. What are you going to do? David interrupted. Contest the will? Drag the family through a legal battle? Isn't that exactly what Dad spent his career fighting against? Michael fell silent, his jaw working. Eleanor finally spoke up. Your father was a complicated man. He didn't always know how to show it, but he loved all of you. Whatever his reasons, we need to respect his wishes. Easy for you to say, Sarah said quietly. You got what you expected. Same as me. Outside, rain began to fall, pattering against the windows of the house that had held so many secrets. The Wilson family stood in the study of their patriarch, suddenly strangers to one another, wondering what else they didn't know. In the days following the reading of the will, the Wilson household became a battleground of cold shoulders and slammed doors. Michael threw himself into work at the firm, arriving before dawn and leaving well after midnight. Sarah extended her hospital shifts, volunteering for surgeries that kept her away from home. David disappeared for 3 days, returning unshaven and exhausted, refusing to say where he'd been. Eleanor watched her children fragment with quiet desperation. This wasn't what Thomas would have wanted. On Friday evening, she called a family dinner. Non-negotiable, she told each of them. 7 o'clock sharp. They gathered around the dining table, the fine china set out as if it were a holiday. Eleanor had cooked Thomas's favorite pot roast, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed. The first 15 minutes passed in uncomfortable silence, broken only by the clink of silverware against plates. I met with Richard yesterday, David finally said, setting down his fork. About Wilson Properties. Michael's hand tightened around his wine glass. And I'm keeping it, David said firmly. But I want to be clear about something. I didn't know about any of this. Dad never told me. Convenient, Sarah muttered. It's the truth, David insisted. I was as shocked as any of you. Michael leaned forward. So what did his letter say? Why you? David hesitated, glancing at Eleanor. It's complicated. Uncomplicated, Michael demanded. Eleanor placed her hand over Michael's. Perhaps this isn't the time. No, Mom, Sarah interrupted. We deserve to know. Dad left David a fortune while the rest of us got. Well, not nothing, but nowhere near equal shares. There has to be a reason. David pushed back his chair and walked to the window, looking out at the darkening yard. Dad knew I wasn't happy at law school. He pushed me into it anyway. I was having panic attacks, couldn't sleep. The pressure was unbearable. We all faced pressure, Michael said dismissively. Not like this, David turned around. Do you remember Jackson Roberts? Dad's client from the Baldwin case. Michael nodded slowly. The pharmaceutical CEO. Dad got him acquitted. He was guilty, David said flatly. Dad knew it. I found evidence, accidentally, when I was interning at the firm that summer. Documents Dad had hidden. Roberts' company had falsified safety data. Their drug killed people. The room went silent. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. That's why you left, Sarah realized. You found out Dad was defending a murderer. I confronted him, David continued. He said sometimes justice wasn't black and white, that the firm needed clients like Roberts to survive, that I'd understand someday. Michael shook his head. That's just how the legal system works. Defense attorneys represent guilty people all the time. This was different, David insisted. Dad actively helped cover up evidence. I couldn't be part of that. I couldn't be him. So you ran away, Michael said coldly. And now he's rewarded you for it. It wasn't a reward, Eleanor said quietly. All eyes turned to her. It was restitution. You knew about this? Sarah asked, shocked. Eleanor nodded slowly. Not everything. Thomas didn't discuss his cases with me. But I knew something happened between him and David. Something that broke them both. In his letter, David said, Dad wrote that he respected my choice. That walking away from the firm took more courage than staying. He said Wilson Properties was built with clean money, Real estate investments. Nothing connected to the firm. He wanted me to have something untainted. Michael stood abruptly, his chair scraping the floor. So I get the dirty business, is that it? The family firm with its dirty secrets and guilty clients? While the prodigal son gets the golden goose. Michael, that's not fair, Eleanor began. No, what's not fair is finding out my father was apparently ashamed of everything I've dedicated my life to. Michael shouted. Was he ashamed of me too? For following in his footsteps? He was proud of you, Eleanor insisted. He just wanted to make amends, David finished. He knew he'd driven me away. This was his way of saying sorry. Sarah had been quiet, processing everything. If what you're saying is true about Roberts and the evidence, that's serious, David. That's disbarment, potentially criminal charges. Which is why I never told anyone, David said. Until now. Michael paced the room, running his hands through his hair in a gesture identical to their father's. So what happens next? You take your millions and disappear again? Buy a nicer bookstore? David shook his head. I don't know what I'm going to do with the company yet, but I'm not disappearing. He took a deep breath. Actually, I came back to Oak Ridge for good 3 months ago. I've been living above the bookstore, working on a novel. A novel? Sarah raised an eyebrow. About a lawyer who discovers his mentor crossing ethical lines, David said quietly. Fictional, of course. Michael stopped pacing. You're writing about Dad? About our family? It's not about exposing anyone, David insisted. It's about understanding why good people make bad choices. Why families keep secrets. Eleanor stood up, gathering plates with trembling hands. Your father made mistakes. We all have. But he loved you all fiercely. Did he ever regret it? Sarah asked. The Roberts case? Every day, David said. That's what he told me in the letter. Every time he heard about another family affected by Roberts' drug, he regretted it. But he never publicly admitted it. Michael leaned against the mantelpiece, studying the family portrait above it, taken when David was still in high school, all of them smiling, Thomas's hand proudly on Michael's shoulder. The firm has other clients like Roberts, he said quietly. Not many, but enough. Clients Dad cultivated, introduced me to. What are you going to do? Sarah asked. Michael shrugged helplessly. I don't know. I can't just torch the firm's reputation. People depend on me. Our employees, their families. Maybe there's a middle way, David suggested cautiously. A way to transition the firm toward more ethical clients. Michael shot him a look. Now you care about the firm? I care about you, David said simply. And I don't want Dad's mistakes to define your career too. A heavy silence fell over the room. Years of unspoken tensions, of paths chosen and abandoned, of a father's complex legacy weighing on them all. I have a surgery at 6 tomorrow, Sarah finally said, standing up. I should go. Sarah, Eleanor began. I need time, Sarah said firmly, to process all this. She paused at the doorway. Is there anything else we don't know, Mom? Any other family secrets waiting to explode? Eleanor looked at her daughter sadly. Your father wasn't perfect. Neither am I. But everything we did because we thought it was best for this family. As Sarah left, Michael turned to David. I want to read the letter. David hesitated, then nodded. Okay. Eleanor watched her sons, so different and yet so similar in the ways that mattered most. Both principled, both struggling with their father's complicated legacy, both still searching for their own paths. Outside, the autumn wind scattered leaves across the garden. Thomas had never had time to tend himself. Inside, his family began the messy work of unearthing truths long buried, wondering if they could ever find their way back to each other. A week passed. The Wilson home grew quieter as Sarah returned to her apartment near the hospital, and Michael buried himself in work. Only David and Eleanor remained, circling each other in the too-large house, attempting conversation over morning coffee. Have you spoken to Michael? Eleanor asked one morning, watching David flip through the newspaper. He's avoiding me, David replied. Can't say I blame him. Eleanor sighed. He read your letter? Yeah. David folded the paper carefully. It didn't help. The doorbell rang, startling them both. Eleanor went to answer it, returning moments later with Richard Simmons. The attorney looked grim. We have a situation, he said without preamble. The Preston family is filing a lawsuit against Wilson and Associates. They're claiming Thomas deliberately suppressed evidence in their daughter's case. David felt his stomach drop. Preston, the girl who died from Roberts' drug? Richard nodded. They've hired Jeffries from Boston. They're going after the firm for malpractice and after Roberts' company for wrongful death. How did they find out? Eleanor asked, her voice hardly above a whisper. Someone sent them documentation, Richard said, looking pointedly at David. Evidence that Thomas knew about the falsified safety data. I didn't do this, David said immediately. I didn't say you did, Richard replied. But this puts Michael in an impossible position. The firm could collapse under this. David grabbed his phone. I need to talk to him. But Michael wasn't answering calls. David drove to the firm, a glass and steel building downtown that had always intimidated him. The receptionist recognized him immediately. Mr. Wilson is in a partners meeting. It's extremely urgent. I know what it's about, David interrupted. Tell him his brother is here. 10 minutes later, Michael emerged, looking like he'd aged years overnight. He silently led David to his office, their father's old office, still bearing the heavy wooden desk where Thomas Wilson had built his empire. Did you do it? Michael asked as soon as the door closed. No, David said firmly. I swear, Mike. I would never. Michael studied him, then collapsed into his chair. They have copies of documents I didn't even know existed. Internal memos from Roberts' company. Dad's notes about them. The same documents I found. Probably. Michael loosened his tie. The partners are talking about settling, cutting Roberts loose as a client. But the damage. I'm sorry, David said, meaning it. Michael laughed bitterly. For what? Being right? Dad was protecting a criminal. I've been defending the indefensible. You didn't know? I should have. Michael slammed his hand on the desk. There were signs. Things Dad said. Cases he kept to himself. I chose not to see them. David sat across from his brother. What can I do? Michael looked up, surprised. Why would you want to help? You got out. You have your clean millions. Because despite everything, you're my brother, David said simply. And because I know what it's like to have your world fall apart. A knock interrupted them. Michael's assistant poked her head in. Mr. Wilson, your sister is on line 1. She says it's urgent. Michael picked up the phone. Sarah? His expression changed as he listened. More listening. We'll be right there. He hung up, face pale. Mom collapsed at home. Sarah's meeting us at the hospital. The emergency room buzzed with activity, but Sarah had pulled strings. Eleanor was already in a private room when they arrived, looking frail against the white sheets. A heart attack, Sarah explained quietly. Mild, caught early, but concerning. The stress, Sarah said, her doctor's detachment slipping. This lawsuit, everything coming out, it was too much. Eleanor was sleeping, monitors beeping steadily beside her. The 3 Wilson children gathered in the hallway, united by worry. Who sent those documents to the Prestons? Sarah asked. Not me, David said immediately. I believe you, Sarah said, surprising both her brothers. Which means someone else knew. Someone else had copies. Michael ran a hand over his face. Dad's paralegal, maybe. Or someone at Roberts' company with a conscience. Whoever it was, Sarah continued, they've known for years. Why come forward now? Dad's death, David suggested. It makes Roberts vulnerable. They fell silent, contemplating the implications. A nurse approached, informing them that Eleanor was awake and asking for them. They entered the room together. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears at the sight of her 3 children, side by side for the first time in years. My boys, she whispered. My girl. I'm sorry. Don't talk, Mom, Sarah said, checking the monitors. You need to rest. No, Eleanor said with surprising firmness. I need to tell you. I sent the documents. The silence in the room was absolute. You? Michael finally managed. Eleanor nodded weakly. After Thomas died, I found them in his study. A sealed envelope labeled Robert's case, personal. I read everything. Her voice broke. That drug killed 26 people. Children. And your father helped hide it. Why would you expose it now? David asked. You must have known what it would do to the firm. To Michael. Because of you. Eleanor said, looking at David. Your novel. When you said it was about a lawyer making bad choices, I realized Thomas's secret would haunt this family forever unless the truth came out. Michael looked stunned. You sacrificed the firm? My reputation. To save your soul, Eleanor whispered. Thomas's secrets ate away at him for years. Changed him. I couldn't watch the same happen to you. Sarah took her mother's hand. The stress of this nearly killed you, Mom. Some things are worth the risk, Eleanor replied. The Prestons deserve justice. And you children deserve the truth. Michael turned away, staring out the window at the hospital parking lot. The firm won't survive this. 15 years of my life gone. Not necessarily, David said quietly. All eyes turned to him. Wilson Properties, David continued. It's worth millions. Enough to settle with the Prestons. Enough to keep the firm afloat while you rebuild its reputation. You do that? Michael asked, disbelieving. On one condition, David said. The firm drops all clients like Roberts. No more defending the indefensible. You rebuild as a firm with principles. Dad's original vision before things went wrong. Michael studied his younger brother, seeing him clearly perhaps for the first time. Why would you save the firm? You hated what it became. I hated what happened to our family because of it, David corrected. The secrets, the divide between us. But the firm itself? That was Dad's dream. Your dream now. Eleanor watched her sons, tears sliding down her cheeks. Thomas would be proud of you both. Sarah looked between her brothers. So what happens now? Now, David said, taking his mother's hand, we tell the truth. All of it. Together. Michael nodded slowly. A fresh start. Outside the hospital window, evening fell over the town. In a quiet room, the Wilson family began the long process of healing. Not just Eleanor's heart, but the bonds between them that had frayed but never fully broken. I found something else in Dad's study, Eleanor said softly. Letters he wrote to each of you but never sent. About how proud he was. How sorry for his mistakes. Even to me? David asked. Especially to you, Eleanor confirmed. He wrote that watching you walk away was the bravest thing he'd ever seen. That you taught him what integrity meant. Michael wiped at his eyes. And me? That you were the son he'd always wanted, Eleanor said. But that he feared he'd taught you the wrong lessons. And me? Sarah asked quietly. Eleanor smiled. That you were the wisest of his children. The one who might eventually bring her brothers back together. Sarah laughed through tears. No pressure there. As night fell, the three Wilson children remained by their mother's bedside, finally talking, really talking, about their father, their childhood, their fractured paths, about forgiveness and second chances, about family. In the coming weeks, there would be settlements to negotiate, a firm to restructure, a novel to finish. There would be difficult moments and old resentments resurfacing. But for the first time in years, they would face these challenges together. Inheritors not just of Thomas Wilson's complicated legacy, but of the chance to build something better from the ruins of secrets too long kept. The Wilson family's drama didn't stay private for long. In a town like Oak Ridge, news spread quickly, especially when it involved one of the most prominent families in a high-profile lawsuit. As Eleanor recovered in the hospital, reporters camped outside the family home and the firm's offices. Michael found himself dodging questions on his way into court. Sarah was cornered by a journalist in the hospital parking garage. David received 3 book deal offers based solely on rumors about his novel. This is insane, Michael said, closing the blinds in his office as another news van pulled up outside. They're acting like we're the Kennedys. People love a scandal, Richard Simmons observed, spreading settlement papers across Michael's desk, especially one with such cinematic elements. Family betrayal, corporate malfeasance, hidden millions. These are our lives, Michael muttered. The settlement with the Preston family was private but substantial, $15 million from Wilson Properties, enough to ensure the victims' families were taken care of while leaving sufficient capital for David to reinvest in the firm. The gesture had touched Michael deeply, though he still struggled to express it. I don't know how to thank you, he told David awkwardly when the papers were signed. David had simply shrugged. It's what Dad should have done years ago. Now, a month after their mother's heart attack, the 3 siblings sat in Michael's office, surrounded by boxes of case files. They'd spent weeks combing through the firm's client list, identifying those who, like Roberts, had skeletons the Wilsons had helped bury. That's the last of the problematic legacy clients, Sarah said, closing a file with a grimace. 7 in total. 7 out of 53 active corporate clients, Michael said. Better than I feared. Worse than I hoped. What about the Taylor case? David asked, referring to a construction company accused of using substandard materials. Michael hesitated. They're our 3rd largest client. And? Sarah pressed. And there's evidence their CEO knew about the materials issue, Michael admitted. Not enough for criminal charges, but enough that defending them would be challenging. David leaned back in his chair. So that's 8. Michael nodded reluctantly. 8 clients representing about 40% of our annual revenue. The siblings exchanged glances. The magnitude of what they were undertaking was sinking in. Transforming the firm meant not just cutting ties with unethical clients, but actively turning against some of them, potentially representing plaintiffs in suits against former clients where conflicts of interest didn't exist. The partners are going to revolt, Michael said, voicing what they were all thinking. Some will, David agreed. The ones Dad brought in during the Roberts era. The ones who knew. And the others? The younger associates? The ones who came to practice law because they believed in justice. David smiled slightly. I think they'll stay. I think they'll be relieved. Sarah, who had taken a leave of absence from the hospital to help her brothers, shuffled through some papers. I've been looking at the firm's financials. Even if we lose these clients, with David's investment and the remaining ethical client base, we could stay afloat for about 18 months. Long enough to rebuild. Michael looked at his sister with newfound respect. When did you become a business expert? Hospitals are businesses too, Sarah said with a wry smile. And surgeons need to understand budgets. You'd be surprised how similar the skills are, cutting away the dead tissue so the healthy parts can survive. David laughed. Graphic, but accurate. For the first time in weeks, Michael felt a sense of possibility rather than doom. So we make a clean break. No more ethical compromises. The Wilson firm stands for justice or nothing at all. Dad would hate this, David said, and love it at the same time. That's our father in a nutshell, Sarah agreed. A knock at the door interrupted them. Michael's assistant entered with a concerned expression. Mr. Wilson, the other partners have called an emergency meeting. They're waiting in the conference room. Michael glanced at his siblings. Showtime. Want us to come with you? Sarah asked. Michael straightened his tie, a determined look crossing his face. No, this is my firm now. I started acting like it. The partners' meeting was as contentious as expected. 3 of the 7 partners, all Thomas Wilson's contemporaries, threatened to leave, taking their clients with them. Michael let them vent, listening to accusations of betrayal and naivety. When they finally ran out of steam, he spoke quietly but firmly. My father built this firm on principles of justice and integrity. Somewhere along the way, he lost sight of that. I won't make the same mistake. If you want to represent clients who harm people for profit, you're welcome to do so elsewhere. If you want to be part of something you can be proud of, stay and help me rebuild. 2 partners walked out that day. The third, Martin Green, who had been Thomas's oldest friend, lingered after the others left. Your father wasn't always like this, you know, he told Michael. When we started out, he turned down wealthy clients if he thought they were in the wrong. He did pro bono work for half the town. What changed him? Michael asked. Martin shrugged sadly. Success. Pressure. The recession in the 80s nearly wiped us out. Thomas had 3 kids in private school, a mortgage on that big house. Roberts came along offering more money than we'd ever seen. One compromise led to another. And you went along with it. I did, Martin admitted. To my shame. Maybe that's why I'm staying now. One last chance to make it right. When Michael returned home that evening, he found David and Sarah sitting with Eleanor in the kitchen. His mother looked better. Some color had returned to her cheeks, and she moved with more energy. How did it go? David asked. Michael loosened his tie. 2 partners quit, and we're going to lose at least 6 more associates when they find out their clients are being dropped. Eleanor reached for her son's hand. Are you okay? Michael looked around at his family. His mother's concern, Sarah's steady support, and the brother he'd resented for so long now an unexpected ally. I am, he realized. For the first time in years, I know exactly what I'm doing and why. To Wilson and Associates 2.0, Sarah proposed, raising her water glass in a mock toast. Actually, Michael said, I was thinking of a different name. Wilson, Wilson, and Wilson. David blinked in surprise. You want me to join the firm? After everything. You have a law degree gathering dust, Michael pointed out. And Sarah's proven she has a head for business. We'll need all hands on deck to pull this off. I'm a surgeon, Sarah protested. I'm not asking you to quit medicine, Michael clarified. But maybe you could consult on medical cases. Help us understand when a defendant in a medical malpractice suit is actually at fault versus when it's just a tragic outcome. David leaned forward. You're serious about this? Dead serious, Michael confirmed. Dad built this firm with the people he trusted most. I want to rebuild it the same way. Eleanor watched her children with quiet pride. The Wilson legacy was transforming before her eyes, the secrets and competitiveness that had divided them now fostering an unlikely collaboration. Outside, rain tapped against the windows, but inside the kitchen was warm with possibility. The path forward wouldn't be easy. There would be financial struggles, client defections, and inevitable setbacks. But for the first time in decades, the Wilsons faced these challenges united, their father's complicated legacy becoming the foundation for something new. 6 months later, David sat at his desk in what had once been a storage closet at the law firm, now converted into a cramped but functional office. The wall opposite him featured a framed copy of his book cover, The Price of Silence by D.T. Wilson, published by Atlantic Press 3 weeks earlier. The novel had been a risk. Fictionalized as it was, anyone in Oak Ridge could recognize the parallels to the Wilson family and the Roberts case. David had shown the manuscript to Michael and Sarah before submitting it, giving them veto power over anything they found too revealing. To his surprise, neither had asked for changes. "It's the truth," Michael had said simply. "Not the literal events, but the emotional truth. It needs to be told." Now the book was climbing the bestseller lists, helped by the real-life drama that had played out in legal and medical circles. David had done a few carefully selected interviews, always steering the conversation away from specifics of the actual Roberts case and toward the broader themes of his novel: ethical compromise, family dynamics, the weight of legacy. A knock on his door pulled David from his thoughts. Lisa Chun, one of the young associates who had stayed through the firm's transformation, stood in the doorway clutching a file. "The Anderson deposition just came in," she said. "You were right. The company knew about the contamination for months before the recall." David nodded. The Anderson case, a small organic food company accused of selling products with traces of pesticides, was exactly the type of case the old Wilson firm would have buried evidence for. Now, they were representing the consumers seeking accountability. "Thanks, Lisa. Could you let Michael know? He's taking the lead on this one." As Lisa left, Sarah appeared, still in her surgical scrubs. She'd maintained her position at the hospital, but now spent Tuesday and Thursday afternoons at the firm, reviewing medical cases and advising on strategy. "You look exhausted," David observed. 6-hour surgery, Sarah confirmed, collapsing into a chair. "But we saved his leg. How's the book tour going?" "It's not really a tour. Just a few local bookstores and a radio interview next week." David hesitated. "They want me on Morning America, though." Sarah's eyebrows shot up. "National television? Are you going to do it?" "I don't know. Michael thinks it could bring good publicity for the firm's new direction." "And more details about the Roberts case becoming public," Sarah pointed out. "There's still litigation pending." David nodded. The Richards lawsuit, a class action against Roberts's pharmaceutical company, was proceeding, with the evidence Eleanor had released forming the cornerstone of the plaintiff's case. Roberts himself had resigned as CEO, though he continued to deny knowledge of the falsified data. "I'd keep it to the themes of the book," David assured her. "Nothing that could affect the legal proceedings." Sarah studied her brother. "You're enjoying this, aren't you? The writing, the attention." David smiled ruefully. "Not the attention so much, but the writing, yeah. For the first time in my life, I feel like I'm doing what I'm meant to do." While also being a part-time lawyer, Sarah added. "Community service," David quipped. "Making up for my misspent youth." Sarah laughed, then grew serious. "Have you talked to Mom about the book? She's the only one who hasn't read it." "I gave her a copy, but," David shrugged, "I think it's still painful for her. The parts about Dad especially." "She's proud of you," Sarah assured him. "She told me so. Proud of all of us, actually." Their conversation was interrupted by Michael bursting into the office, a newspaper in hand and an unusual grin on his face. "We got it," he announced. "The Westfield class action. Judge Bradley just assigned it to us." Sarah and David exchanged shocked looks. The Westfield case, involving hundreds of homeowners whose properties had been contaminated by industrial waste, was the biggest environmental lawsuit in the state's history. "That's huge," David managed. "How do we get it?" Judge Bradley said she was impressed by the firm's ethical reorganization, Michael quoted proudly. "Plus, Martin's environmental law experience tipped the scales." "Can we handle something this big?" Sarah asked practically. "We're still understaffed after the exodus." "It'll stretch us thin," Michael admitted. "But this is exactly the kind of case we should be taking, holding powerful interests accountable, helping ordinary people who've been harmed. David noticed his brother's energy, the light in his eyes that had been missing for years. "You're enjoying this too," he realized. "The rebuild." Michael shrugged, slightly embarrassed. "It feels good to be proud of my work again. To not dread looking in the mirror every morning." The Wilson siblings shared a moment of understanding. Each had found an unexpected path to fulfillment through the family crisis. Sarah balancing medicine with legal consultation, David combining writing with part-time legal work, and Michael reinventing the firm he'd once resented inheriting. Later that evening, David stopped by the old family home. Eleanor was in the garden, tending to autumn moms. She looked up as he approached, shielding her eyes from the setting sun. "I brought dinner," David said, holding up a bag from Eleanor's favorite Italian restaurant. Inside, as they set the table, Eleanor finally brought up the book. "I read it," she said quietly. "Your novel." David paused. "What did you think?" "It was painful," she admitted. "Seeing Thomas through your eyes. The disillusionment. The betrayal." She touched her son's hand. "But it was beautiful too. The forgiveness at the end." "It's fiction, Mom," David reminded her gently. "Is it?" Eleanor smiled sadly. "The lawyer in your book forgives his father for moral compromises. Have you forgiven yours?" David considered the question carefully. "I think I understand him better now. The pressures he faced, the choices he thought he had to make to protect his family and legacy. That's not the same as forgiveness," Eleanor observed. "No," David agreed. "But it's a start." They ate in companionable silence for a while. Finally, Eleanor said, "The Garden Club ladies have all read your book." Mrs. Patterson was quite convinced the corrupt judge character was based on her husband. David laughed. "Judge Patterson? He handles traffic court." "I didn't correct her," Eleanor confessed with a small smile. "Sometimes people need to feel important, even in unflattering ways." As they finished dinner, David's phone buzzed with a message from Michael. "Contract finalized with new environmental client. Biggest retainer in firm history. We're official white knights now." Eleanor noticed his smile. "Good news." "The firm's going to be okay," David confirmed. "Michael's rebuilding it into something Dad would be proud of." He hesitated. "Something I'm proud to be part of, even peripherally." Eleanor reached across the table to squeeze his hand. "Your father made many mistakes, but his children weren't among them. The three of you together, you're healing not just yourselves, but his legacy too." David thought about the novel's ending. Unresolved in many ways, the protagonist still grappling with his father's moral failings while recognizing his own imperfections. Art imitating life, or perhaps guiding it. The Wilson family story continued to unfold, each chapter revealing new complexities and opportunities for redemption. Outside, the first leaves of fall drifted from the maple trees Thomas had planted when they first moved into the house. Inside, mother and son talked into the night about family secrets, second chances, and the messy, imperfect process of becoming whole again. 1 year to the day after Thomas Wilson's funeral, the family gathered at Oak Hill Cemetery. The morning was crisp, the trees adorned in brilliant autumn colors. Michael arrived first, placing a simple arrangement of white lilies on the grave. Sarah came next, with Eleanor on her arm. David was last, having driven from New York where he'd been for a publishing event. They stood in silence for several minutes, each lost in private thoughts, before walking together to a nearby bench. "I always thought this day would be harder," Eleanor said, breaking the quiet. "But I feel peaceful." "The firm won the Westfield case yesterday," Michael told them. Final settlement came in. $312 million for the homeowners. Sarah whistled low. "That'll help some families rebuild their lives." "And the firm's reputation," David added. "Quite a turnaround in a year." Indeed, Wilson, and Wilson, as it was now officially named, though everyone still called it the Wilson firm, had emerged from its ethical crisis stronger than before. The exodus of lawyers had eventually reversed as the firm's new direction attracted idealistic young attorneys and experienced lawyers disillusioned with corporate practice. They'd moved to larger offices downtown, the old buildings association with Thomas's compromised years too strong to overcome. Dad would hardly recognize the place, Michael admitted. "I'm not so sure," Eleanor said. "I think he'd recognize the firm he originally built, before Roberts, before the compromises started." They shared a look of understanding. Over the past year, Each had come to terms with Thomas Wilson's complex legacy in their own way. Michael had preserved what was worth saving in his father's professional life while discarding the rest. Sarah had deepened her commitment to healing, both as a surgeon and as the family's emotional center. David had exorcised his demons through writing, his novel now translated into 11 languages. And Eleanor had rediscovered herself, not just as Thomas Wilson's widow or the Wilson children's mother, but as a woman with her own strengths and identity. She'd started teaching art at the community center, reviving a passion set aside decades ago for family obligations. "I sold the house," Eleanor announced suddenly. 3 heads turned to her in surprise. "Since when?" Sarah asked. "The offer came in last week. I accepted yesterday." Eleanor smiled at their shocked expressions. "It's too big for just me, and it holds too many memories, some wonderful, some painful." "Where will you go?" Michael asked. "I've put a deposit on a cottage near the lake. 2 bedrooms, a studio space for my painting, and a garden I can actually manage myself." Eleanor looked at each of her children. "It's time for a fresh start. For all of us." David nodded slowly. "I've been offered a teaching position at Hudson Valley College. Creative writing, 1 semester a year." "You're moving back?" Sarah couldn't hide her surprise. "Not permanently," David clarified. "I'll keep my place in the city, but I'll be around more. Close enough to handle my legal cases at the firm and see my family without a 3-hour drive." Michael cleared his throat. "Speaking of family, Kate and I are expecting." A moment of stunned silence. Then Sarah threw her arms around her brother. "That's amazing." "When?" "June," Michael said, his usual reserve cracking to reveal genuine joy. "We found out last month. Wanted to be sure everything was healthy before telling everyone." Eleanor wiped away a tear. "Your father would have loved being a grandfather." "We're naming him Thomas if it's a boy," Michael said quietly. "Not because Dad was perfect, but because his story, all of it, the good and the bad, is part of our story too." The wind picked up, sending leaves swirling around the cemetery. David thought about legacy, how it wasn't just what was left behind, but what was built from those remains. His novel had brought him unexpected success, but its greatest value had been in helping him process his complicated feelings about his father. The book had ended with reconciliation, not because it was neat or easy, but because forgiveness was the only path forward from pain. "I have news too," Sarah said, breaking into his thoughts. "I've been asked to head the new trauma center at Boston General. It's a big promotion." "That's wonderful," Eleanor beamed. "You've worked so hard for this." "There's more," Sarah continued. "Part of the position involves creating protocols for identifying victims of corporate negligence, patients whose conditions might be linked to environmental factors, defective drugs, that sort of thing. The hospital wants to partner with legal advocates." She looked at her brothers meaningfully. "Lawyers who specialize in holding corporations accountable." Michael caught on immediately. "A formal partnership between the hospital and the firm?" "More like a coalition," Sarah explained. "Medical professionals, researchers, attorneys, patient advocates, making connections that might otherwise be missed." David nodded slowly. "So the Roberts case wouldn't happen again. Someone would spot the pattern before 26 people died." "Exactly," Sarah confirmed. "And guess who's funding the initiative? The Preston family, from their settlement money." The symmetry wasn't lost on any of them. The case that had nearly destroyed their family was now seed money for something that might help countless others. After leaving the cemetery, they drove to Eleanor's house, soon to be someone else's house, for one last family dinner in the home where they'd grown up. Michael's wife Kate joined them, her pregnancy just beginning to show. Martin Green came too, bringing wine he couldn't drink since his doctor had put him on heart medication. Sarah's colleague Dr. Patel, whose friendship had evolved into something more serious over the past months, arrived with dessert. The dining room table that had hosted so many tense family dinners now held a different kind of gathering, one where the past was acknowledged but not allowed to overshadow the present. They told stories about Thomas, not just the sanitized version of the successful attorney, but the complex man who had coached little league games and argued important cases and made serious mistakes. To Dad, Michael proposed a toast, who taught us what to be and sometimes what not to be. To Thomas, Eleanor added softly, who would be proud of what his children have built from his flawed foundation. Later, as they were preparing to leave, David found himself in his father's study. It had been cleared of most personal items, but the built-in bookshelves still held Thomas's law books and history volumes. David ran his fingers along the spines, remembering how as a child he'd thought his father was the smartest person in the world because he'd read all these books. "Finding inspiration for your next novel?" Michael asked from the doorway. David smiled. "Maybe, though reality has been surprising enough lately." Michael entered, hands in pockets. "I never properly thank you for what you did with Wilson Properties, for coming back to help rebuild." "You never had to," David replied simply. "The firm's your legacy too," Michael continued. "Whether you're a full-time lawyer or not, there will always be a place for you there." David nodded, touched by the sentiment. "And there will always be a Wilson brother to keep you honest." They shared a smile, not the cautious, guarded expressions of a year ago, but something warmer and more genuine. Outside, leaves continued to fall, blanketing the lawn in reds and golds. Inside, the Wilson family prepared to scatter to new homes, new relationships, new chapters. But unlike the leaves, they weren't breaking apart, but rather spreading their influence wider, carrying forward the lessons learned through their hardest season. As the sun set on their childhood home for perhaps the last time, David thought about the ending of his novel, the protagonist recognizing that his father's failings had shaped him as much as his father's strengths had. In fiction as in life, there were no perfect resolutions, just the ongoing work of understanding, forgiving, and choosing a different path forward. The Wilson legacy, once tarnished by secrets and compromise, was being recast through the choices of a new generation. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. There would still be disagreements, still be moments when old wounds resurfaced. But there would also be Christmas gatherings at Eleanor's Lake Cottage, strategy sessions in the firm's new conference room, a baby's first steps, a second novel in progress. Life, moving forward imperfectly but honestly, which was all anyone could really ask for. As they locked up the house and walked to their cars, Eleanor paused to look back at the place where she'd spent most of her adult life. "Goodbye," she whispered, not to the house itself, but to the weight of secrets it had contained. Then she took Sarah's offered arm and walked toward the future, surrounded by the family that had broken apart and found its way back together, stronger at the mended places, like pottery repaired with gold.